How will you tell your personal narrative? Of course, you can just tell the story the way you might tell it to a friend, talking about yourself in first person, saying, I did this and this happened, including some interesting, vivid detail and telling us why this moment matters. However, there are many ways for you to tell a story. So today we're going to explore a few options. We're going to experiment with a few, and then I will send you off to start to think about how you specifically want to tell your story. Remember, there's no right or wrong way, and you can absolutely tell your narrative as a straight story. There's nothing wrong with that, and you could tell the most amazing story that way. But there are many other approaches that you can take, and sometimes coming at your story from a different angle can be a really great decision. Let's look at a couple possibilities. My first example is inspired by a book called How to Eat an Airplane by author Peter Pearson. In this book, Peter was actually inspired by a man who did, in fact, eat an airplane. So the book begins, if you want to eat an airplane, there are a few things you should know. The truth is, most airplanes are too large to eat by yourself. So if you want to eat an airplane, you should have a party. Invite guests. So you can see that this book is taking this idea of eating an airplane and it's having a lot of fun with it. A personal narrative could be told as a how-to. You could think about a time in your life when you learned something important, and you could use it as an example to show us how to, or possibly how not, to do something that happened to you. Another example is inspired by the book Dear Mr. Henshaw. In this book, the story is told in a series of letters. So a young boy writes to an author, he writes letters, and then the author writes letters back to him. This is another really interesting way to tell a story because when you're writing letters, you have a different kind of tone than you might have when you're telling a story. And a narrative can definitely be told in a series of letters. Or you could let an idea like this inspire you and maybe use a different form of communication, like text message or email, or even writing to yourself in a journal. There are so many different ways that we use writing to communicate, and so you can absolutely tell your narrative in a different form like this. My next idea is inspired by the book Ideas Are All Around by Philip Stead. In this book, he actually goes on a walk trying to come up with an idea for his story. So one of the things that I love about this idea is that he is actually telling us what he's thinking as he's trying to come up with a story. And he tells a very interesting moment of just walking around his neighborhood looking for a story idea and finding one. This, even though it seems like a teeny tiny moment, is a peek inside of his thought process of how he comes up with ideas for his writing, and it makes an excellent personal narrative. So I wanted to point this idea out to you because, first of all, it is telling the story of this moment in the moment, and also it's not a spectacular moment. It's not those high emotion moments we were talking about before. It's a pretty small moment, and yet it's such a wonderful story. It's something I would absolutely recommend that you check out if you want to see an example of this. Now you'll notice when I was coming up with ideas, I went to my bookshelf. I thought about how other authors have told their stories. I looked at some fiction, I looked at some nonfiction, because no matter what kind of book I'm looking at, I can get ideas from it for my own writing. But in fact, you can get ideas from lots of other places, even if they're not books, like from songs or from paintings or from photographs. I'm sure you can come up with so many different places you might come up with a possible idea. Here's the activity I would like for you to try. Step 1 is to list at least 3 different ways that you might tell your personal narrative. One might be as a story, another might be as a script, and the third might be as a poem. Step 2 is to write 1 or 2 paragraphs in that style. So if you're doing a poem, it might be 2 stanzas. Or if it is a script, it might be 8 lines. But the idea here is to experiment with these different styles to see if you find something that you like. And remember that one great way to come up with a new, fresh idea is to put 2 possibilities together in an unexpected way. You might have heard in the movies where they say this movie is this story meets that story, or people say that about books sometimes too. When you think about your personal narrative, maybe it is something meets something else, and you can play around with those possibilities. Once you've experimented a little bit, your next job is to make another choice, decide how you want to tell your personal narrative, and draft it out. Remember, you can always change your mind later. You can draft something and then draft something new in the future. And certainly you should always remember that your first draft is just that. It won't be perfect. No writer has ever in the history of the world written an absolutely perfect first draft. So go ahead and let it be messy. Remember that once you're done with the whole draft, you'll have plenty of time to go back and revise. In our next videos, we will explore how to add layers and revise your narrative. How do you add tone or description? How do you add more dialogue or more energy? We'll play around with a lot of possibilities. So check back with us soon, and thanks so much for joining us for Spill Some Ink with Stone Soup.